The year was 1945. Berlin was burning. The once unstoppable war machine of Nazi Germany was reduced to rubble and chaos. Inside the collapsing Third Reich, men who once commanded legions, who once held entire nations in their grip, now found themselves cornered, desperate, and hunted. Among them was Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, the architect of terror, and one of the most powerful men in Hitler's empire. Yet, in the final days of the war, Himmler was no longer the untouchable overlord of a vast empire of fear. He was a fugitive, a man marked by betrayal, illusions, and desperation. Himmler had spent the war building a shadow empire within the Nazi regime. While Hitler raged and Goebbels spread propaganda, Himmler controlled the SS, the Gestapo, and the sprawling concentration camp system that enslaved millions. He was methodical, calculating, a man who spoke in quiet tones but built a machinery of death unlike anything Europe had ever seen. To many, he was the second Führer, the one man who could carry on Hitler's vision if the dictator fell. But history had other plans. As the Red Army closed in on Berlin from the east and the Western Allies pushed in from the west, the Nazi leadership fractured. Trust dissolved, and survival became the only goal. Hitler locked himself in the Führer bunker, refusing to face reality. Goebbels prepared his family for a fanatical death. Göring attempted a power grab that ended in disgrace. And Himmler, the man who had built his entire life on loyalty to Hitler, made a decision that would destroy him. He tried to negotiate with the Allies behind the Führer's back. The setting was surreal. In the spring of 1945, with Germany in ruins, Himmler secretly reached out through intermediaries in Sweden and Switzerland. He believed he could present himself not as a criminal, but as a potential partner for the West against the Soviet Union. In his mind, the Allies would see him as a useful figure, someone who could preserve order in a shattered Germany and perhaps even fight the communists alongside them. But this fantasy ignored one crucial fact. By then, Himmler was synonymous with genocide. His name was etched in the blood of millions. Yet Himmler clung to the illusion. While Hitler screamed in rage beneath Berlin, Himmler traveled north, moving through the remnants of a collapsing Germany, seeking safe passage and political leverage. He convinced himself that if he distanced from Hitler, if he could prove he was reasonable, he might survive. It was a dangerous gamble, and it exposed him as a traitor in the eyes of the Führer. When Hitler learned of Himmler's betrayal in April 1945, his fury was volcanic. The man he had once trusted above almost all others was now branded a traitor. In the bunker, Hitler raged that Himmler had stabbed him in the back at the very moment of Germany's collapse. Goebbels fanned the flames, denouncing Himmler as a coward. By the time Hitler wrote his political testament just days before his suicide, Himmler's name was cursed, his loyalty erased. Imagine the atmosphere. In Berlin, artillery thundered day and night as Soviet troops advanced street by street. Buildings crumbled, civilians hid in basements, and Nazi officials scrambled like rats. Hitler prepared to end his life rather than be captured. But Himmler? He refused to accept his fate. He still imagined there was a path out, that somehow he could escape judgment. And so began his final journey. A journey into disguise, desperation, and death. By early May 1945, Germany had surrendered. The war was officially over. But for Himmler, the nightmare had only just begun. No longer a leader, he became a fugitive among millions of displaced soldiers and refugees. He shed his SS uniform, dressed as a common soldier, and carried forged papers under the name Heinrich Himmler. The man who once commanded the Gestapo now hoped he could vanish into anonymity. But anonymity was impossible. Himmler was too notorious, too recognizable, his face too etched in the collective memory of Europe. Allied forces were on high alert, hunting down Nazi leaders with relentless efficiency. And Himmler, for all his illusions, was now just another man on the run. The irony is chilling. For years, Himmler had built an empire of surveillance, a system where no one could hide from the SS. Yet now he himself tried to disappear into the masses, hiding behind false documents, growing a scruffy beard, wearing an eye patch to appear wounded. He even joined a group of soldiers retreating through northern Germany, hoping safety lay in blending in with the defeated. But his luck would not last. The net was closing. The Allies had captured Göring, Dönitz, and countless other high-ranking Nazis. Trials were being prepared at Nuremberg. The world demanded accountability, and Himmler's name was at the top of the list. He was not only an officer of the regime, he was its executioner, the man who oversaw the final solution. His capture was inevitable. Still, in those final days, Himmler clung to a bizarre sense of destiny. He believed history would see him not as a monster but as a builder of order. He even drafted speeches he hoped to give to the Allies, framing himself as a stabilizer who could help rebuild Germany. To imagine this is to understand the depth of his delusion. The very man responsible for death camps and mass executions believed he could reinvent himself as a statesman. The walls of his fantasy collapsed on May 21, 1945. Near Bremervord in northern Germany, Himmler was stopped at a British checkpoint. He carried forged papers, and for a moment it seemed he might slip through. But British officers, suspicious of his behavior, forced him to undergo a routine search. When they discovered who he really was, the mask of Hitzinger was ripped away. The man who once ruled through fear was now a prisoner. And this is where the story takes its darkest turn. For in the days following his capture, Himmler's life ended in mystery. The official version states that he bit into a cyanide capsule hidden in his mouth, committing suicide before he could be interrogated. But for decades, rumors and theories have circulated. Some claim the British killed him to silence him. Others argue that he was allowed to die to prevent embarrassing revelations about secret negotiations. Whatever the truth, his death sealed the fate of one of the most feared men of the 20th century. But to understand Himmler's final days, we must first dive deeper into the psyche of a man who built his empire on loyalty, only to betray it at the very end. Into the chaos of Nazi Germany's collapse, where paranoia and desperation consumed its leaders. And into the chilling question: was Himmler's death truly his own choice, or was it orchestrated by forces that wanted him gone? Because in the ruins of 1945, truth was as much a casualty as the millions who had perished before. By April 1945, the world Himmler had so carefully constructed was falling apart. For more than a decade, he had been the architect of terror, the man who turned Hitler's hateful vision into an organized system of oppression and extermination. But as the Allies closed in on every side, Himmler's mind shifted from ideology to survival. And survival for him meant betrayal. The truth is, Himmler was never the fanatical ideologue that Hitler was. He was a bureaucrat of death, someone who valued order, structure, and power above all else. He liked to present himself as calm, rational, and meticulous. In reality, he was one of the most dangerous men in Europe precisely because he did not see himself as evil. He saw himself as a functionary, a man fulfilling his duty. But in April 1945, duty meant nothing. Loyalty meant nothing. What mattered was, how could Heinrich Himmler save himself from the inevitable reckoning that was coming? It was at this moment that Himmler made a decision that would shock even his closest associates. He began to secretly reach out to the Western Allies, Britain, the United States, and particularly through neutral Sweden. His plan was audacious, almost absurd. He believed he could negotiate a partial surrender of German forces in the West, exclude the Soviet Union from peace talks, and position himself as a new interim leader who could preserve Germany against communism. The channel Himmler chose was Count Folke Bernadotte, a Swedish nobleman and diplomat who had been involved in humanitarian negotiations. Through Bernadotte, Himmler sent word. He was willing to surrender German forces in the West if the Allies would allow him to remain in some kind of leadership role. He wanted to be seen not as a criminal but as a negotiator, a statesman who could preserve stability. But Himmler miscalculated in the most spectacular way. By this point, the Allies knew exactly who he was and what he had done. The photographs of the liberated camps at Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen were already shocking the world. Eyewitness testimonies painted Himmler as the mastermind of the most systematic mass murder in history. To think that Britain or the United States would ever sit down with him was madness. Yet in Himmler's mind, it was logical. He believed that because the Allies feared the Soviets, they would turn to him as a buffer. When Hitler discovered Himmler's betrayal on April 28, 1945, the reaction was immediate and furious. In the Führer bunker, Hitler was already surrounded by paranoia, convinced that betrayal lurked everywhere. Göring had just attempted to claim leadership, which enraged Hitler to the point of stripping him of his titles. But Himmler's disloyalty cut deeper. Himmler had been one of his most trusted men, his loyal Heinrich, the man who had been at his side for 2 decades. Now, in Hitler's eyes, he was a Judas. Goebbels, ever the fanatic, fueled the rage. He denounced Himmler as a traitor, a coward who dared to think of survival while the Reich fought to the death. In his last political testament, written before his suicide, Hitler expelled Himmler from the party and condemned him by name. In those bunker walls, Himmler's fate was sealed. The man who had spent his life pledging loyalty to Hitler was now cursed as a betrayer. This betrayal had consequences beyond Himmler's personal downfall. It symbolized the disintegration of the Nazi elite in those final days. No longer bound by ideology or unity, they turned on each other like predators in a cage. Each sought to preserve themselves, each gambled on survival, and each was ultimately destroyed. Himmler's gamble, however, was the most delusional of all. As news spread of Himmler's expulsion, panic and confusion rippled through the SS. The man who had built the order now stood outside of it. For many SS officers, this was incomprehensible. To them, Himmler was second only to Hitler. Yet here he was, stripped of his power, reduced to a desperate schemer. Meanwhile, the Allies dismissed his offers outright. When Himmler's intermediaries presented his proposal to the Americans and the British, the response was cold. No negotiations, no deals. Germany's surrender had to be unconditional. Himmler had nothing to bargain with. Worse still, his attempt at negotiation exposed him to Hitler's wrath and destroyed his credibility with the Allies. In one move, he had alienated both sides. But Himmler could not accept the reality. He continued to believe there was a way forward. He envisioned himself leading a post-Hitler Germany, perhaps even negotiating with Eisenhower or Churchill. He told himself that he was different from the others, not like Goebbels, who was consumed by fanaticism, or Göring, who was ridiculed for his incompetence. He was, in his mind, a man of order, a reasonable figure who could be useful in the chaos. This delusion carried him through the final weeks of April and into May. While Berlin collapsed and Hitler took his own life, Himmler roamed northern Germany, plotting, scheming, and pretending that destiny still had a role for him. His entourage shrank, his authority vanished, but still, he clung to the illusion. The irony of Himmler's downfall is striking. For years, he had demanded absolute loyalty from others. He punished betrayal with brutal efficiency. Within the SS, loyalty to Himmler and to Hitler was absolute. Disobedience meant death. Yet when the moment of truth arrived, Himmler himself betrayed the very oath he had enforced on millions. He became the thing he hated most, a traitor, and betrayal, once committed, could not be undone. By May 1945, Himmler was a man without a master, without an army, without a future. The Allies did not want him. Hitler had condemned him. The SS no longer followed him. And so Heinrich Himmler, once one of the most powerful men in the world, was reduced to a fugitive, a man wandering through the ruins of his own empire. But betrayal is only the beginning of his end. The question that remains is, how did this fugitive, stripped of power and hunted by the Allies, spend his last days? What happened between his expulsion from the Nazi elite and his sudden death in British custody? And was his death truly his choice? Or was there more to the story than the official record reveals? The deeper we dig into those final weeks, the more chilling the picture becomes. Himmler did not simply vanish into obscurity. He traveled, he disguised himself, he carried with him the weight of his crimes, and he faced choices that would seal his fate forever. Because for all his attempts to betray, to negotiate, to manipulate, one truth remained. There was no escape. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the crunch of boots on dirt paths. Heinrich Himmler, the once feared Reichsführer SS, was no longer commanding armies, nor dictating the fate of millions. He was now just another fugitive wandering the collapsing ruins of the Reich. His glasses, round and distinctive, had been replaced by wire-rimmed spectacles borrowed from a subordinate. His black SS uniform had long been discarded. Now he wore the dull gray-green of a field soldier, his insignia carefully removed. Even so, his posture betrayed him. The stiffness, the strange arrogance, the aura of a man still clinging to authority. But inside, something else was unraveling. Himmler's mind was a storm. The Reich he had served obsessively, even fanatically, was disintegrating around him. The Allies were closing in, the Führer was dead, and the men who had once saluted him with fanatic devotion were scattering like dust in the wind. Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered that Himmler had tried to betray Hitler. Others said he had already met secretly with the Allies. But here he was, hidden under false papers that identified him as Sergeant Heinrich Himmler. He clung to this name as if it could shield him from the vengeance of the world. The days blurred into restless marches, sleepless nights, and hollow meals shared with a shrinking band of loyal aides. They moved cautiously through northern Germany, avoiding Allied patrols, slipping past villages reduced to rubble. Each step carried Himmler further from the seat of power he once controlled, deeper into a life of exile. His face, recognizable across Europe, had to remain in shadow. He was now a ghost traveling among the living. Every night, the group sought abandoned houses, barns, or woods to rest. Himmler avoided speaking, though occasionally he muttered about destiny and sacrifice. His adjutants, Langen, Grothmann, and others, listened in uneasy silence. They had once revered him as the architect of terror, the master planner of the SS Empire. Now he was a tired man in a worn uniform, carrying secret cyanide capsules in his pocket. But Himmler still clung to hope. He believed he could negotiate his survival. In his twisted logic, he thought the Allies would recognize his value. He convinced himself that because he held vast knowledge of the Reich's inner workings, because he had been the architect of police and intelligence networks, they might spare him. Perhaps even use him against the Soviet Union. After all, weren't the Western powers already wary of Stalin? Himmler believed he could reinvent himself, not as Hitler's shadow, but as a potential ally to the victors. It was a delusion, but one that kept him moving. The collapse of Germany was like a mirror shattering. Everywhere, pieces of a broken empire lay scattered. Himmler's group occasionally crossed paths with other Nazi officials on the run, each with their own disguise, their own story of betrayal or loyalty. Some tried to blend with the millions of refugees clogging the roads. Others sought to vanish forever into anonymous peasant life. But Himmler could not. His role was too great, his crimes too vast, his face too recognizable. Wherever he turned, he saw the collapse of everything he had built. Cities reduced to ashes. SS men stripped of their insignia, pretending to be ordinary soldiers. Fear painted across every face. At night, Himmler's dreams tormented him. He saw endless processions of prisoners, the camps he had overseen, the trains rolling relentlessly east. The system he had engineered now haunted him in silence. Yet he did not repent. He rationalized everything as duty, as necessity. If history was collapsing, then he too would collapse with it. But not without bargaining, not without one last chance. By May 21, 1945, the fugitive group reached the small town of Bremervord, north of Hamburg. British troops were everywhere, conducting sweeps for Nazi officials. The Allies had already captured Göring, who had surrendered willingly. Others, like Dönitz, the so-called successor to Hitler, were also under arrest. For Himmler, time was running out. At a British checkpoint, Himmler and his entourage were stopped. They handed over their forged papers. The soldiers were suspicious, especially of the strange-looking sergeant, whose bearing didn't match his supposed rank. They were sent to a holding area with other prisoners of war. Himmler's disguise held for a moment longer, but only barely. British intelligence officers, experienced in spotting Nazi leaders attempting to hide among the masses, began to notice his peculiar features. The round glasses, the clipped speech, the way others deferred to him unconsciously, despite his supposed status as a common soldier. Whispers spread. Could it be him? On May 22nd, British officers began interrogating prisoners more closely. When Himmler was questioned, His nervousness betrayed him. His papers were scrutinized, his story probed. Finally, under mounting pressure, Himmler decided to reveal himself. With a mix of arrogance and desperation, he declared, "I am Heinrich Himmler." The words froze the room. The soldiers were stunned. They had not just captured any fugitive, they had captured the Reichsführer SS, one of the most infamous men alive, the architect of the Gestapo, the overseer of concentration camps, the right hand of Hitler himself. The revelation spread quickly. Guards tightened around him, officers reported up the chain of command, and news reached the highest levels of Allied leadership. Himmler was not just another prisoner. He was a symbol, a man who embodied the crimes of the regime. But what to do with him? The next hours were a blur of harsh lights, tense questioning, and the cold realization that his delusions of negotiating power were collapsing. Himmler insisted he had tried to oppose Hitler in the final days, that he had attempted to seek peace. He painted himself as a pragmatist, someone who wanted to save Germany from destruction. He spoke of his supposed willingness to cooperate against the Soviets. But the British were not convinced. To them, Himmler was not a potential ally, he was a criminal of the highest order. Every word he spoke only deepened their disdain. His rationalizations sounded hollow, his attempts at self-preservation pathetic. The man who once commanded millions now begged for recognition, trying to convince his captors of his usefulness. For the officers questioning him, it was a grotesque spectacle. The collapse of a man who had embodied terror, now reduced to pleading, bargaining, and excusing. What the British did not know, at least at first, was that Himmler carried his own death sentence hidden in his mouth. Like many high-ranking Nazis, he had been given cyanide capsules, concealed within dental fixtures. The capsule rested behind his teeth, ready to be crushed if capture became unbearable. As interrogators pressed harder, Himmler shifted nervously, touching his jaw, clenching and unclenching his mouth. Guards noticed but did not understand. Himmler knew the moment of decision was near. If he could not bargain his way into survival, he would deny his enemies the satisfaction of a public trial. He would write his own ending. This thought obsessed him. The Nuremberg trials loomed in his mind, visions of standing in a courtroom as the world spat its judgment upon him. For a man who thrived on control, humiliation was worse than death. He would not allow himself to become a spectacle. And so, even as he answered questions, he plotted the one act left in his power. Himmler was transferred under heavy guard to a British detention camp near Lüneburg. Soldiers surrounded him, wary of escape attempts. His true identity confirmed, he was now one of the most valuable prisoners of the war's aftermath. Yet he seemed eerily calm. Perhaps he knew what was coming. Perhaps he had already chosen. The other prisoners whispered about him. Some spat in his direction. Others stared with fascination. To them, this was the once mighty Reichsführer SS, reduced to a prisoner like the rest of them. His aura of fear was gone. He was not a god of terror anymore. Just a man with tired eyes and trembling hands. Still, he carried the secret in his mouth. The capsule, smooth and deadly, remained his only escape. Soon, the world would discover whether Heinrich Himmler would face justice or deny it forever. The night of May 22, 1945, was dense with fog, the kind that muffled every sound and made even the simplest footsteps echo like whispers of ghosts. Heinrich Himmler sat inside a British military truck, flanked by guards, his hands trembling slightly, though he tried to keep them steady. His spectacles caught the faint glow of lanterns. The once mighty Reichsführer SS, the man who had commanded millions, was now a prisoner in the custody of the very men who had crushed his empire. The convoy rattled toward the town of Lüneburg, where British intelligence officers waited. The war was over, but in these twilight days of May, the fate of captured Nazi leaders still hung like a sword. Would they be sent to trial? Executed without ceremony? Used as bargaining chips in the new Cold War taking shape? Himmler told himself he would not allow others to dictate his fate. He still had one weapon left, silent, invisible, hidden between his teeth. A cyanide capsule, his final line of control. The truck pulled into the courtyard of an old schoolhouse. now converted into a temporary detention center. Barbed wire ringed the building, and armed soldiers paced under the pale moonlight. As Himmler was marched inside, prisoners and guards alike turned to stare. Whispers spread like wildfire. "That's him. The butcher of Europe, Himmler himself." Inside, he was led down narrow corridors that smelled of damp wood and cigarette smoke. The guards kept a close watch, noting his every twitch. He was placed in a small interrogation room with bare walls, a single desk, and 2 chairs. The air was thick with tension. A British officer entered, Major Norman Whitaker, a stern man with piercing eyes. He carried a folder of documents and the authority of a victor. The sight of Himmler did not impress him. He had seen prisoners before, men who had once been powerful and were now nothing more than shadows of themselves. But even so, there was something surreal about standing across from Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the SS state. Whitaker began calmly, asking for confirmation of Himmler's identity. Himmler tried to maintain composure, his voice quivering between arrogance and fear. "Yes, I am Heinrich Himmler." It was both confession and defiance. For years, he had lived in shadows, whispering orders from the heart of the Reich. Now, with his empire destroyed, he spoke openly. But the weight of his words was not what he imagined. They no longer carried authority, only infamy. The questioning grew sharper. Whitaker pressed him about war crimes, about the SS, about his role in the machinery of death that had consumed millions. Himmler deflected, as he always had. He spoke of duty, of responsibility to the state, of his attempts to negotiate peace in the final weeks. He painted himself as pragmatic, even reasonable. But the British officers weren't buying it. His words rang hollow against the knowledge of the camps, the testimonies of survivors, the documents already piling up as evidence. To them, Himmler wasn't a negotiator. He was the embodiment of the Reich's darkest crimes. As the interrogation dragged on, one of the British doctors present, Captain Wells, noticed something peculiar. Himmler seemed to move his jaw oddly, as if working his mouth in nervous patterns. Wells had seen this before. Rumors circulated among Allied troops that high-ranking Nazis carried poison capsules, concealed in their teeth or uniforms. Suspicion grew. The doctor stepped closer, shining a small light into Himmler's mouth. For the first time, true panic flickered in Himmler's eyes. The guards noticed. Orders were barked. Himmler was told to open his mouth to submit to a medical search. For a brief moment, time froze. Himmler hesitated. His lips pressed tightly together. His hands trembled. Then, in a sudden, desperate motion, he bit down. A sharp crack, glass and powder, a bitter taste flooding his tongue. Himmler's body jolted violently as the cyanide spread through his system. His face twisted, his eyes wide with both terror and grim resolve. The guards shouted, lunging to restrain him. The doctor tried to force his mouth open, jamming fingers against his jaw, but it was too late. Within seconds, Himmler convulsed, collapsing onto the floor. His skin turned pale, then bluish. Foam gathered at his lips. His eyes rolled back. In less than a minute, Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, one of the most powerful men of the Third Reich, was dead. The room was filled with stunned silence, broken only by the frantic shouts of soldiers and the fading gasps of a dying man. For the guards, it was like watching history end in their very hands. They had captured him alive, but he had denied them justice, denied the world the spectacle of a trial. The body lay still on the wooden floor, awkwardly twisted, the glasses slightly askew. A doctor knelt beside him, checking for a pulse, though everyone knew the outcome. The cyanide worked quickly and mercilessly. Himmler was gone. For a moment, the officers stared in disbelief. The man who had once commanded terror across continents had chosen to end his life in a schoolhouse interrogation room in Lüneburg, surrounded not by generals or SS men, but by foreign guards who regarded him with contempt. His empire had fallen, and his final act was one of cowardice. The guards exchanged glances. Some cursed under their breath. Others looked almost relieved. The burden of keeping such a prisoner alive was now lifted, though the frustration was immense. They would never hear him testify. They would never see him face justice. The world had been robbed of answers that only Himmler could provide. News traveled quickly. Senior British officers arrived to confirm the death. Himmler's body was placed on a simple stretcher, his lifeless face partially covered by a blanket. Soldiers carried him through the corridors, past rows of prisoners who craned their necks to catch a glimpse. Some gasped, others sneered, a few laughed bitterly. The body was examined one last time by military doctors, confirming the cause of death: cyanide poisoning. The capsule had been cleverly hidden, likely fitted into his dental work, undetected during the initial searches. It had been his last insurance policy, and he had used it perfectly. But what to do with the corpse of Heinrich Himmler? For the British, there was no question. They would not allow a shrine, a burial site that could be turned into a monument for future extremists. The body would vanish just as his power had. Late at night, under strict secrecy, Himmler's corpse was carried to a wooded area near Lüneburg. Only a handful of British soldiers knew the location. There, in an unmarked grave, they buried him quickly, the earth swallowing the remains of the Reichsfuhrer. No marker, no ceremony, no farewell. Just silence. The spot was deliberately kept hidden, erased from maps, guarded only by the memory of those who carried the stretcher. Himmler would leave no grave for mourners. His name would not adorn any stone. His resting place would be the same as his empire, lost to ashes, remembered only through infamy. Back in the schoolhouse, soldiers and officers reflected on what had happened. Many felt cheated. The Allies had wanted Himmler to face trial at Nuremberg, to stand in the dock alongside Göring, Hess, and the others. His testimony could have illuminated the machinery of the Reich, the inner circle of power, the decisions that had led to genocide. Instead, he had silenced himself. His death left a void in the historical record, a series of unanswered questions. Perhaps that was his final act of control, denying the world the satisfaction of hearing him condemned in public, escaping the humiliation of judgment. But others saw it differently. They believed his suicide was not control, but surrender, a coward's way out. The man who had demanded absolute loyalty, who had orchestrated terror with cold efficiency, could not face the reckoning he deserved. His end was not heroic, not defiant. It was pitiful. As dawn broke over Lüneburg, the world learned of Himmler's death. Newspapers would soon print the headlines: Himmler dead, suicide by poison. For many, it was a moment of grim closure. The architect of the SS had been erased, not by justice, but by his own hand. Yet his death was more than the end of a man. It was the symbol of the Reich itself, grandiose, cruel, and ultimately self-destructive. Himmler's cyanide bite was the final echo of a regime built on lies and violence. His name would live on, but only in infamy, not as a savior of Germany, not as a negotiator with the Allies, but as a coward who chose poison over accountability. And in the silence of his unmarked grave, the earth held its secret. The final resting place of a man who once believed he could shape history, and who instead was consumed by it. The news of Himmler's death rippled through the corridors of power before it reached the public. For the Allies, the end of the Reichsfuhrer SS was both a relief and a frustration. They had captured one of the most notorious architects of terror, only to watch him cheat the gallows. Instead of standing under the judgment of Nuremberg, Heinrich Himmler had vanished into the void by his own hand. In London, the War Office received the news with cold disbelief. Churchill, who had long insisted that Nazi leaders should be punished swiftly, remarked bitterly that Himmler had escaped the justice he deserved. In Washington, American officials worried that his suicide robbed them of a valuable source of intelligence. They had hoped to peel back the layers of the SS machine, to learn about secret networks, hidden gold reserves, and the survival strategies of fugitives. In Moscow, Stalin's response was blunt. For him, Himmler was already condemned, guilty beyond redemption. His suicide was seen not as defiance, but as weakness, a confirmation that the Nazi elite were crumbling, incapable of facing responsibility for their crimes. Soviet propaganda quickly seized on the event, portraying Himmler's death as proof that fascism was cowardly at its core. For the survivors of the camps, the news struck differently. To many, it was not relief, but bitterness. Men and women who had endured the SS machinery of death wanted to see Himmler dragged before the world, to hear his voice tremble as evidence was laid bare. They wanted to see him condemned publicly, not vanish silently in a locked room. Some survivors described his suicide as another theft. He had stolen from them the moment of justice. He had robbed them of the chance to see the Reichsfuhrer forced to confront the horror he had unleashed. In their eyes, his cyanide capsule was not bravery, not even desperation. It was an insult. For Jewish survivors, especially, Himmler's absence from the Nuremberg trials left a permanent void. He could have been forced to answer for the ghettos, the Einsatzgruppen, the deportations, the camps. Instead, his silence left questions unanswered, and history had to piece together his role from documents and testimonies without his own voice to confirm or deny. At Nuremberg, the prosecutors felt the loss keenly. While Göring, Hess, Ribbentrop, and others stood in the dock, Himmler's chair was empty. His name still appeared in the indictments, his crimes still catalogued, but he was a ghost hovering over the trial. His absence made Göring, ironically, the most prominent Nazi on trial, giving him the spotlight he craved. Some historians later argued that if Himmler had lived to face justice, the dynamics of the trials might have been different. The man who commanded the SS, who oversaw the final solution, might have overshadowed Göring's theatrical performances. But history was denied that spectacle. Robert Jackson, the American chief prosecutor, lamented privately that Himmler's suicide was a lost chance to reveal the very soul of Nazism in the light of day. Even in death, Himmler's presence lingered. His secret burial in an unmarked grave was designed to prevent martyrdom. But whispers spread. Rumors circulated that he hadn't really died, that the British had faked his suicide, that he had been spirited away to South America or to the Soviets. Conspiracy theories flourished in the ruins of Europe. In reality, his corpse rotted in the soil of Lüneburg, forgotten by most, remembered only in documents locked in Allied archives. But his shadow haunted post-war Germany. For years, traces of the SS remained. Underground networks, old loyalties, fugitives moving along ratlands to South America. Himmler had built a machine so vast that its echoes endured long after his death. For the German people, the news of Himmler's death landed with a dull thud. By May 1945, most Germans were exhausted, starving, displaced. Few shed tears for him. In many ways, his death symbolized what most Germans wanted to forget: the complicity, the fanaticism, the blind obedience. But historians later pointed out a bitter irony. Himmler, who had demanded absolute loyalty and sacrifice from millions, had refused to face sacrifice himself. He had chosen poison over responsibility. His death became a symbol of cowardice, proof that the so-called faithful Heinrich could not remain faithful to his own ideology when confronted with judgment. In the decades that followed, historians worked tirelessly to reconstruct Himmler's role in the Reich. His meticulous archives, the SS bureaucracy, and survivor testimonies painted a chilling portrait. Unlike Göring, who had craved the spotlight, Himmler had thrived in the shadows, building a state within a state. His legacy was not just military or political, it was ideological. Himmler fused pseudoscience, occult myths, and racial fanaticism into the SS worldview. He transformed ordinary men into executioners, bureaucrats into architects of genocide. He turned ideology into machinery, and machinery into death. That legacy haunted Europe. The Holocaust, the concentration camps, the millions murdered, all carried his fingerprints. Even though he died in obscurity, his shadow stretched across generations. Himmler's suicide also shaped the memory of the war itself. By dying when he did, he denied the world a fuller reckoning of his crimes. Some argue that history was cheated of a deeper understanding of the SS machine. Others argue that his silence made his crimes speak louder, that his refusal to face justice was itself an admission of guilt. Either way, his death was not an escape. It was a historical punctuation mark, a reminder that even the most powerful can collapse into fear. His cyanide capsule did not erase his deeds. It only sealed his infamy. Even today, Himmler's death raises questions. How do societies remember men like him? Should they be given space in memory or erased entirely? By burying him in an unmarked grave, the Allies denied him martyrdom, but they also created mystery. His bones, somewhere under German soil, still whisper a question. How could one man, so unremarkable in appearance, wield such destructive power? The lesson of Himmler is not only about power but about banality. He was not a warrior, not a charismatic orator, not even a soldier in the traditional sense. He was a bureaucrat with fanatic beliefs, a man who looked like a clerk but orchestrated a machinery of death. His end in a schoolhouse, biting a hidden capsule, reflects that same banality. A life of cruelty ended in cowardice, without grandeur or dignity. As we look back, Himmler's story is not just the story of a man. It is the story of a system that allowed men like him to rise. His final act reminds us of a truth that history repeats. Power built on fear cannot last. The Reich that Himmler dreamed would endure for 1,000 years collapsed in 12. The man who once commanded millions ended in silence, his grave unmarked, his name cursed. His death denied justice, but it also delivered a message. Evil, no matter how organized or powerful, consumes itself in the end. History is not only about remembering the dates and the names. It's about confronting the uncomfortable truths, the shadows that linger long after men like Himmler are gone. His death may have robbed us of a trial, but it forces us to ask the harder question. How do ordinary people, through obedience and belief, create monsters in their midst? And perhaps that is why Himmler's story still matters today. Because if we don't ask those questions, if we don't recognize the warning signs, then history can repeat itself in ways we least expect. So let me leave you with this. If one man like Himmler could build a machine of terror under the guise of duty, how many others, hidden in plain sight, might do the same in our own time? That is why we remember. That is why we tell these stories.